The parcel that nobody wanted had been available for 3 years before Sera Vance put her name on it. It was not expensive. That was one of the two things people said about the north face of Corvin Slope when they said anything about it at all. The second thing they said was that it was not expensive for a reason, and the reason was visible from the road without requiring any inspection. 47 acres of exposed limestone shelf, thin soil over rock, gradient too steep for conventional cultivation, aspect that the agricultural wisdom of the Corvin Valley had long since classified as unsuitable for the crops that the valley grew, and the methods the valley used to grow them. The valley floor was rich. Deep alluvial soil, reliable water from the Corvin Creek, south-facing exposure across most of the cultivated ground, the kind of land that rewarded the investment of labor and seed with the consistency of a productive arrangement that had been working for a generation and showed no signs of stopping. The families of Corvin Valley were not wealthy people, but they were not uncertain people, and the source of their certainty was the soil under their feet and the weather above it and the accumulated knowledge of how to manage both. Nobody had found a reason to manage the north face of Corvin Slope. Sera Vance was 26 years old and she paid $9 for 14 acres of it. She had come to the Corvin Valley 2 years before from the wine country of the eastern settlements, not from a winemaking family, not from any commercial viticultural background, but from a girlhood spent watching her Italian-born grandmother tend a small backyard vineyard in a city where grapevines were a domestic pleasure rather than a commercial operation. What her grandmother had grown were not the commercial varieties that the eastern wineries ran. They were old varieties, brought from the old country in the particular way that immigrants bring the things they cannot leave behind, planted in a narrow south-facing strip between two buildings, and tended with an attentiveness that her grandmother had described when Sera asked about it, as simply paying the vines the respect they were owed. Her grandmother had also said something else, across a table on an October afternoon when the harvest was in, and the kitchen smelled of crushed fruit and the particular satisfaction of a thing completed, something that Sera had written in the small notebook she kept, and had not had occasion to act on until the Corvin Slope parcel notice arrived in the settlement's trading post bulletin. The best wine I ever tasted came from the worst ground I ever saw. The vine does not want comfort, it wants to work. She had read the notice 3 times. She had looked at the slope from the valley road on 2 separate mornings, in different light, in the specific way that a person looks at something they have already decided about from different angles to confirm that the decision holds. It held. She paid $9 for 14 acres of exposed limestone shelf on the north face of Corvin Slope, and took possession on the first Monday of April 1883. The transaction was noted at the trading post with the mild interest that attends an outcome nobody has strong feelings about, mild because the parcel had been available so long that its sale was more resolution than surprise, and mild because the buyer was a young woman without an established farming operation, and the community's assessment of her prospects was tempered accordingly. She had not yet told anyone what she intended to plant. But she knew this the way a woman knows something she cannot yet prove, that the limestone shelf of Corvin Slope, which the valley had spent 3 years declining to value, was not worthless ground. It was the wrong ground for corn and wheat, and the conventional crops of a valley floor operation. It was, if her grandmother's knowledge and her own 2 years of reading, and the 3 sections of the French viticultural survey she had ordered from the Eastern bookseller were accurate, precisely the right ground for what she intended. The vine does not want comfort. It wants to work. She began clearing the slope the following morning. The clearing took 6 weeks. Not because the slope was heavily vegetated. The limestone shelf supported sparse growth, scrub brush, and the occasional stunted cedar that had found a crack wide enough for roots, but because clearing was only the first step, and the first step needed to be done in a way that did not waste the second. She did not try to eliminate the limestone. This was the decision that most of the valley's men, watching from the road below, would have identified as the thing she was doing wrong, the thing that explained why the slope had not been cultivated before, and why it would not be cultivated successfully now. You could not farm rock. You could not produce a worthwhile crop in ground that was more stone than soil, and that offered a depth of workable earth measured in inches rather than feet. This assessment was correct for the crops the valley grew. It was not correct for what she was planting. The viticultural survey, the section she had marked and returned to most often across the winter of reading that had preceded the purchase, was explicit on the point that her grandmother's October comment had introduced, and that the survey's data confirmed with the specificity of a document compiled by people who had spent careers studying why the best wine came from the places it came from rather than the places it should have come from by conventional agricultural logic. Grapevines in deep, rich soil produced abundantly. They produced fruit in volume, fruit that was diluted by the ease of the conditions, fruit that made wine that was competent and consistent and forgettable. Grapevines in poor soil, in thin ground over rock, in conditions that required the root system to descend through cracks in the limestone in search of the moisture and minerals that a comfortable vine received without effort, those vines produced less fruit. The fruit they produced was more concentrated. The wine made from that fruit was not competent and consistent. It was the thing people traveled for. She prepared 38 planting pockets across the first 2 acres of the slope, not rows in the valley floor sense, but individual positions between the limestone outcroppings where she had found, by probing with an iron bar, sufficient depth and sufficient crack structure for a vine root to descend. Each pocket she improved with a mixture of the thin native soil, composted material she had been building since February, and the wood ash from the previous winters, fires that the viticultural survey identified as a beneficial amendment for limestone-based plantings. She set 38 cuttings in the 3rd week of May. Old varieties, the ones her grandmother had grown, sourced through a letter she had written in January to a nursery in the eastern settlements, whose catalog listed heritage varieties that the commercial operations had abandoned in favor of higher-yielding modern stock. The nurseryman had written back with the directness of a man pleasantly surprised to receive an inquiry for varieties he had kept largely out of sentiment. He had them. He could supply them. He had not sold a cutting of the Dulcetto in 3 years and was glad to know someone still understood what it was for. The cuttings went into the prepared pockets on a Thursday morning, each one set at the depth the survey prescribed, staked with the light stakes she had cut from the scrub cedar, the limestone around each planting used rather than removed, positioned to reflect heat back onto the developing vine during the day and to radiate that stored heat through the cool nights. Warm stone held heat. She had read this in the survey and believed it in the abstract. She would come to understand it differently across the first season, when the evenings on the slope stayed warmer than the valley floor by a margin she could feel by simply standing in both places at dusk. The vines sat through their first summer with the uninspiring composure of cuttings establishing themselves. No dramatic growth, no visible evidence of the root work happening below in the limestone cracks, the above-ground portion doing what newly planted vines do in their first season, which is almost nothing visible and almost everything important. She did not rush them. She watered each pocket individually through the dry weeks of July and August, carrying water up the slope in the way that a person carries water up a slope when they have no alternative. Slowly, repeatedly, with the specific patience of a task that does not improve through being rescented. She noticed most things. She noticed that the vines on the upper slope, where the limestone was thickest and the soil depth shallowest, were showing slightly more stress than the mid-slope vines, not failure, but the particular look of a plant that is working harder than its neighbors. She noted this not as a problem but as information. A vine that was working hard in its first summer was a vine that was sending roots deep into the limestone looking for what the surface did not offer. That was precisely what she wanted. She allowed herself one moment of something close to satisfaction at the end of the first season, not of achievement, because the first season of a vineyard is not an achievement, it is a commitment, but of confirmation that the commitment was correctly placed. She was not ready. But the vines were in the ground and the roots were going down, and the limestone was doing what limestone does when a grapevine finds a crack in it. That was enough, for now it was enough. The second season showed what the first had hidden. The vines that had done nothing visible above ground through their first summer pushed growth in the second spring, with the energy of root systems that had established themselves more deeply than anyone watching from the road below would have guessed was possible. The growth was not profligate. These were not vines in a comfortable valley floor position producing as much vegetation as the season allowed. The growth was directed, purposeful. The canes went where they were going with the specific economy of a plant that has learned what its ground will and will not provide, and has organized itself accordingly. She trained them on the limestone ledges, not on wire trellis in the valley floor manner. The slope did not allow for post-setting at the intervals that conventional trellis required, and she had learned from the survey that the traditional method for hillside viticulture in the old country used the stone itself as structure, training the vine arms along the rock face in a way that maximized the heat absorption from the limestone surface, and kept the fruit clusters elevated above the ground-level humidity that encouraged disease. She trained 36 of the 38 surviving vines in the second spring. 2 had not made it through the first winter. She noted this without revision of the overall assessment and did not replant those positions. The 36 that remained had selected themselves, in the way that plants in difficult conditions select themselves. The ones that could use what the slope offered had used it and had stayed, and the ones that could not had not, and the 36 that remained were therefore, by the logic of that selection, the vines that belonged on this slope. No fruit in the second year. This was expected and correct. Pushing a young vine to fruit in its second season was the mistake of impatience, and impatience was not something she had brought to this slope. Third season. The clusters appeared in June, small, tightly formed, the dark-skinned variety her grandmother had grown, sitting between the limestone ledges in the morning light with the specific beauty of a thing that has been worked for rather than simply grown. She counted them across the 36 vines in the second week of June, and noted the number in her ledger with the same careful understatement she brought to all accounting. She harvested in the second week of September. Not a large harvest, 41 pounds of fruit from 36 vines, 3 seasons in the making. She pressed it in the root cellar she had built into the lower slope in the second year, a modest space, stone-walled, with the consistent temperature that the limestone hillside maintained without assistance. The pressing was simple, and the fermentation was managed with the knowledge assembled from the survey, and from 2 seasons of correspondence with a winemaker in the eastern settlements, who had answered her questions with the generosity of a person who loves their subject, and is pleased to find someone asking intelligent questions about it. She put the first wine into bottles in November. She let it rest through the winter. In March she opened 1 bottle. She held it to the light in the way her grandmother had held things to the light, not for the visual quality of the wine, which told you something but not everything, but for the particular quality of a person paying a thing the respect it was owed before forming an opinion about it. She tasted it. It had the quality of something someone would travel for. She noted this in the ledger without elaboration. First harvest, character confirmed, proceed. She brought 2 bottles to the trading post in April. She did not announce them. She set them on the counter when the owner, a methodical man named Aldous Pierce, who had operated the post for 12 years, and who tasted everything he sold with the professional assessment of a man who understood that his recommendation was his primary commercial asset, was available to receive them. She told him what they were, the variety, the slope, the 3 seasons they represented, and she left them and said she would come back in a week. Aldous Pierce tasted the first bottle that evening. He tasted the second bottle the following morning to confirm what the first had told him, which was the practice of a methodical man who did not trust a single experience with something that surprised him. The second bottle confirmed what the first had told him. He sent a note to her holding on the second day. She came to the trading post on the 4th. He asked how much she had. She told him, 14 bottles from the first harvest, 3 reserved for her own use, 11 available. He bought all 11 at a price she had set with the care she brought to all pricing, on the basis of 3 seasons of labor, the cost of the materials, and the honest assessment of what the product was rather than what the market in a valley that had never produced wine before could be assumed to support. The price was not low. He did not negotiate. He sold the first 3 bottles within 2 days to families in the valley who had purchased wine before, from the eastern settlements, at prices that the distance required and the quality did not always justify. What they received from Aldous Pierce's counter was not that wine. Word was still moving before the first week was out. She could feel it the way a person feels weather before the clouds arrive. By the end of April, Aldous Pierce had asked whether she could supply him with additional stock when the 4th season harvest came in. She told him the 4th season would produce more than the 3rd. The established vines on the limestone slope were producing at a volume she could now project with reasonable confidence, and the character she had observed in the 3rd season fruit was, in her assessment, going to intensify in the 4th as the root systems went deeper and the fruit concentration increased. He took her word for it. He pre-ordered 40 bottles. By May, a merchant from the next valley over, a man who had heard through the particular velocity of commercial news that travels between trading posts when the news is specific and useful, had written to ask whether there was production available for purchase beyond the Corvin Valley supply. She wrote back with the same care she brought to everything: production volume, current commitments, timeline for the following harvest, the price at which additional supply would be available. She was expanding. Not quickly, not in the way that expansion sometimes happens when demand exceeds supply, and the temptation is to meet that demand at the expense of the quality that created it. She expanded in the way that a vineyard expands, by adding to the slope acreage she had already prepared methodology for, by selecting additional planting positions in the limestone with the same individual attention she had given the first 38, by sourcing additional cuttings of the same variety from the same nurseryman who was by now writing her letters that began not with the transaction, but with questions about how the dulcetto was behaving on the limestone. She added 19 positions in the 4th spring, not because demand required it immediately, because a vineyard is a long enterprise and the decisions made in year 4 determine what exists in year 7, and she was planning for year 7 with the same patience she had brought to year 1. What she lacked was more seasons. What she had was a slope, a method, and a root cellar with 43 bottles of the 4th season harvest resting in the consistent temperature of the limestone hillside. That was, by the arithmetic of a valley that had not previously possessed a vineyard, considerably more than anyone had expected from $9 and 14 acres of rock. The 5th harvest was the one that people remembered. Not because it was dramatically larger than the 4th. The volume increase was measured and predictable, the expansion she had planned producing the additional fruit she had projected, not because of any single event that the harvest produced, but because the 5th harvest was the one where the root systems of the original 36 vines had been working in the Corvin Slope limestone for 5 years, and had descended, by the evidence of the fruit those roots produced, to a depth and a mineral complexity that the third and fourth seasons had suggested but not fully delivered. The wine from the fifth harvest was different from the wine that had preceded it. Not unrecognizably different. The character that had been present in the first bottle, the one she had held to the light in March of the third year and noted in her ledger, was present in the fifth harvest wine the way a theme is present in its full development. The same idea, elaborated to its potential by time and depth, and the specific mineral quality of the limestone that the roots had been extracting and expressing in the fruit for 5 seasons. Aldous Pierce tasted the fifth harvest sample in October. He set the glass down and looked at it for a moment. He said he needed to know how much she was producing and what her plans were for the following 3 years, because he had a buyer from the city who had been asking him questions he had not previously been in a position to answer. She told him. The buyer from the city arrived the following week, a man who dealt in wines from the eastern settlements and who had been told, through a chain of recommendation that had begun at Aldous Pierce's counter and ended at a dinner table where someone had opened one of the 11 bottles from the first Corvin Slope release and had not been able to stop talking about it in terms that had eventually reached the ears of a person whose professional interest was the quality of wine and who had therefore made the journey. He arrived at the slope on a morning in October when the light was the specific light of late harvest, the golden, raking, forgiving light that autumn makes on hillsides above valleys, and he stood on the limestone for a long time looking at the 36 established vines and the 19 younger ones and the root cellar door and the view across the valley below. He asked how she had known. She told him. Her grandmother's word, a viticultural survey, $9 for 14 acres of limestone, and the specific understanding that a vine does not want comfort. He nodded in the way of a person receiving an explanation that confirms what they had already inferred. He made an offer for the fifth harvest production at a price that Aldous Pierce's pre-order had not approached. She accepted it without the hesitation that would have suggested she was surprised, because she was not surprised. She had done the arithmetic before he arrived, and the number he named was within the range she had calculated. And accepting it without hesitation was the correct response of a person who has priced their work accurately and arrived at a negotiation knowing what it is worth. She noticed most things. She had noticed, in her grandmother's kitchen on an October afternoon, something about the relationship between difficult ground and the quality of what grows in it. She had noticed, in a parcel notice at the Corvin Valley Trading Post, 14 acres of limestone slope that the valley had been declining to value for 3 years, and that the viticultural survey she had ordered from the Eastern bookseller described as conditions associated with the finest wine produced in the old country. She had noticed, in the first March bottle from the first autumn harvest, that the limestone had done what her grandmother and the survey had said it would do. She had not been lucky. The limestone had been there all along. The variety had been waiting in the nurseryman's catalog. The survey had been sitting in the Eastern bookseller's inventory. The grandmother's word had been in the notebook. None of it had required luck. It had required the specific, sustained willingness to pay attention to things that the valley around her had not found worth attending to, and then to act on what the attention produced, and then to be patient enough to let the action work at the pace the work required rather than the pace the impatience demanded. She was, for the first time in the 5 years since she had paid $9 for 14 acres of rock, and had not been able to fully explain why to anyone who asked, exactly where she had meant to be. Not finished, a vineyard is never finished. Not comfortable, the slope required the same daily attention in year 5 that it had required in year 1, and would require the same in year 10. But placed correctly, on the right ground with the right variety, making the right thing from what the limestone offered, and what 5 seasons of patient work had drawn from it. Word was still moving through the Corvin Valley. It had not stopped since Aldous Pierce set a glass down in October and looked at it for a moment before speaking. And on the slope above the valley, in the specific light of a late harvest morning, with the limestone warm under her hands, and the clusters dark and heavy between the rocks and the valley spread below her in the golden autumn haze, Sera Vance allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. Then she went back to work. The vines were not finished either.